She was crying in the recovery room, heartbroken and alone, when a young doctor knocked on the door and changed her life forever. He didn't say a word, just handed her a note, then sat beside her in silence. She thought he was just being kind, until their quiet connection grew into something far deeper than either of them expected. But just as she starts to heal, she discovers he's been hiding something that could tear everything apart. Who is this silent man? What secret has he kept buried all this time? And how far will he go to protect the only woman who ever truly saw him? This is a story of grief, love, and the kind of bond that doesn't need words to be real. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as Mira's eyes fluttered open. Everything felt heavy. Her limbs, her thoughts, even the air around her seemed to press down with invisible weight. The sterile hospital room came into focus slowly, like a watercolor painting gaining detail one brush stroke at a time. She blinked, trying to clear the fog of anesthesia. The mint green walls, the beeping monitors, the familiar smell of disinfectant. It all rushed back with crushing clarity. A nurse in blue scrubs finished adjusting her IV drip and slipped out quietly, her rubber-soled shoes making soft, squeaking sounds against the linoleum floor. Mira's throat felt dry and scratchy. Her hospital gown was twisted uncomfortably around her legs, but she couldn't summon the energy to fix it. A dull ache pulsed deep in her abdomen, like a reminder she didn't want to acknowledge. Again? The word escaped her lips in a whisper, barely louder than a breath. It hung in the air, heavy with all the hopes that had shattered that morning. Her vision blurred as tears welled up, and she pressed her trembling hands against her empty stomach. The tears came faster now, rolling down her cheeks and soaking into the thin hospital pillow. Each sob sent little jolts of pain through her tender abdomen, but she couldn't stop. This pain was familiar, an old friend she never wanted to meet again. Through the haze of tears, fragments of the morning floated back. She remembered sitting alone in the waiting room, the only sound the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the occasional shuffle of papers at the nurse's station. The vinyl chair had been cold against her back as she'd filled out the consent forms, her signature looking small and lost on the dotted line. A kind-faced nurse had brought her water in a paper cup, the same one who'd helped her change into the hospital gown. The woman's gentle smile had almost broken Mira's carefully maintained composure. It was easier somehow when people didn't show kindness, easier to keep the walls up, to pretend this was just another ordinary day. Mira's hand reached for the side drawer of the bedside table, fingers finding the familiar texture of her sketchbook. She pulled it out, running her hand over the smooth cover. Drawing had always been her refuge, her way of making sense of a world that often felt too sharp, too real. But today, as she opened to a fresh page, the blank white expanse seemed to mock her. She picked up her pencil, trying to steady her shaking hand. A fox. She would draw a fox. They were her favorite subjects, with their clever eyes and graceful forms. But the lines came out wrong, wobbling and uncertain. The shape that emerged looked broken somehow, distorted by her trembling fingers and blurry vision. Frustration welled up inside her chest as she scribbled over the failed drawing, the pencil pressing so hard it nearly tore the paper. She snapped the sketchbook shut and dropped it in her lap, pressing the heels of her hands against her eyes. The grief hit her then, sharp and familiar as a winter wind. It cut through the lingering effects of the anesthesia, through the physical discomfort, straight to her core. This wasn't just about today. It was about every hope-filled morning that had ended in this same sterile room, every carefully nurtured dream that had slipped away like water through her fingers. A soft knock at the door made her quickly wipe her eyes, though she knew it was useless to hide the evidence of her tears. A young doctor she didn't recognize stepped in, clipboard in hand. He wore wire-rimmed glasses, and a white coat that looked too new, and when he saw her crying, he stopped short in the doorway. Instead of speaking, he moved slowly into the room, his footsteps deliberate and quiet. The scratch of his pen against paper was the only sound as he wrote something on a small notepad. When he held it out to her, Mira had to blink several times to focus on the words. "Do you want someone to sit with you?" The simple question, offered without demands or expectations, made fresh tears spill down her cheeks. She looked at him, really looked, and saw the gentle understanding in his eyes. After a moment, she nodded. He pulled up a chair next to her bed, its legs scraping softly against the floor. Then he just sat there, a quiet presence that somehow made the room feel less empty. He didn't try to fill the silence with empty comfort or well-meaning platitudes. He just stayed, bearing witness to her grief without trying to fix it. After a few minutes, he reached into his coat pocket and placed something on the tray table, a wrapped tea bag. Then, without a word, he stood and walked to the door. His footsteps were as quiet leaving as they had been entering, and the door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Mira alone with her thoughts and the small gift of his silent compassion. The next day, the morning sun crept through the hospital blinds, casting thin stripes of light across Mira's bed. She lay propped up against the pillows, staring at the blank TV screen mounted on the wall. Her reflection stared back at her, pale, tired, with dark circles under her eyes that looked like smudged charcoal. A gentle knock pulled her attention from the empty screen. The doctor from yesterday entered, and this time Mira's eyes caught his ID badge as he moved toward her bed. Dr. Rowan Vale. He wore the same wire-rimmed glasses and carried the same small notepad, but today his presence felt familiar rather than strange. He wrote something on the pad and placed it beside her hand. The letters were neat and precise. "Would you like some tea today?" Mira nodded, watching as he moved to the shared kettle in the corner of the ward. His movements were deliberate and quiet, like someone used to moving through silence. He didn't try to catch her eye or fill the space with small talk. Instead, he simply poured the steaming water into a paper cup, dropped in a tea bag, and placed it on her tray table. The steam rose in delicate spirals, carrying the subtle scent of chamomile. Dr. Vale settled into the chair beside her bed, his presence as undemanding as yesterday. He didn't reach for his notepad again, didn't try to prompt conversation. He just sat, giving her the gift of companionship without expectation. As the days passed, Dr. Vale's visits became a gentle rhythm in Mira's recovery. He came each morning and evening, always carrying his notepad, always offering tea. His notes were never long, but each one seemed to reach past her defenses with careful precision. One morning, when she'd been staring fixedly at her untouched breakfast, "You don't have to talk." Another evening, when she'd pulled her blanket up to her chin like a shield, "It's okay to not be okay." The hollow feeling in Mira's chest began to shift, not disappearing but becoming somehow more bearable. She started accepting the tea during his visits, wrapping her hands around the warm cup while he sat in his usual chair. The ritual of it, the quiet pour of water, the steep of the tea, the shared silence, became something she found herself looking forward to. Dr. Vale never pushed, never tried to fill the quiet with medical updates or cheerful encouragement. He seemed to understand that some pains needed space more than words, that sometimes presence meant more than platitudes. One afternoon, as sunshine pooled on her blanket and the ward bustled with distant activity, he placed his notepad beside her hand. His message was simple. Grief doesn't like noise. The words hit something deep inside her, some carefully constructed wall that had been holding back the tide. Tears welled up suddenly, spilling over before she could stop them. Her shoulders began to shake with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and raw. Dr. Vale didn't move to comfort her, didn't try to stop her tears or offer tissues. He remained in his chair, steady and present, bearing witness to her pain without trying to fix it. His stillness gave her permission to break, to let the grief wash through her without shame or hurry. The afternoon light had shifted to evening gold by the time her tears subsided. Her throat felt raw, her eyes puffy, but something had loosened in her chest. Dr. Vale placed a fresh cup of tea on her tray table and left with the same quiet steps he always used, giving her space to gather herself back together. That night, after the ward had settled into its evening quiet, Mira reached for her sketchbook. It had been lying unopened since her failed attempt at drawing the fox, but now her fingers itched for her pencil. The blank page didn't seem as threatening anymore. Her first few lines were hesitant, rough with disuse, but they gradually grew more confident. A girl took shape on the paper, sitting with her knees drawn up. Beside her, Mira drew a fox, its tail curled around its paws. Both figures gazed upward at a sky she filled with stars, each one a tiny point of light in the darkness. The drawing wasn't perfect. Some lines were wobbly, some proportions slightly off, but it felt true. It felt like the first real thing she'd created in a long time. Exhaustion crept over her as she finished the last star. The sketchbook settled onto her chest as her eyes grew heavy. On the tray table, the cup of tea Dr. Vale had left sat untouched, still sending up gentle wisps of steam into the quiet room. 1 week had passed since Mira left the hospital. The autumn morning light filtered through her small apartment window, casting a soft glow on her drawing desk. She sat in her favorite chair, a worn but comfortable piece that had witnessed countless hours of creation. Her sketchbook lay open on her lap, pencil moving with growing confidence across the page. The fox was taking shape again, but different this time. No longer a lone figure, it sat closer to the girl she'd drawn before. Their tails touched in a gentle connection that spoke of shared solitude. Mira paused, studying the way the light caught the graphite marks. Her hand moved almost on its own, adding subtle shadows and textures that brought depth to their fur. On her nightstand, partially illuminated by the morning light, sat a folded piece of paper. She'd kept it from Rowan's last visit, his final note before her discharge. "The world still needs your drawings." The words had stayed with her, echoing in her mind during quiet moments. They felt like permission to create again, to let her art speak when words failed. The morning passed slowly as she worked on the drawing. She took breaks to sip water and stretch, mindful of her still healing body. The apartment was quiet except for the soft scratch of pencil on paper and the distant sounds of city life drifting through her window. The silence didn't feel as heavy as it had before. Later that afternoon, Mira found herself back at the hospital for her follow-up appointment. The familiar sliding doors opened with a soft whoosh, releasing a burst of antiseptic-scented air. She hesitated just inside the entrance, her hand clutching her appointment card a little too tightly. The lobby seemed larger somehow, more imposing than during her stay. Light footsteps sounded behind her, and before she could turn, a familiar figure appeared at her side. Rowan stood there, as quietly present as ever, holding out a paper cup of tea. Steam rose from it in delicate wisps, carrying the familiar scent of chamomile. A small laugh escaped her, surprising them both. It was soft and a bit rusty from disuse, but genuine. "You remembered," she said, accepting the cup. The warmth seeped into her hands, grounding her. Rowan's eyes crinkled with a smile as he pulled out his notepad. His pen moved quickly across the paper, and he turned it to show her. "You looked like you needed it." The simple gesture settled something in Mira's chest. She followed him to the clinic area, sipping her tea as they walked. The hospital corridors didn't seem as stark or intimidating with him beside her. His presence had become familiar, comforting in its quietness. The follow-up appointment went quickly. Routine questions, a brief examination, everything healing as expected. Throughout it all, the tea remained a steady comfort in her hands, a reminder of the quiet support that had helped her through the darkest days. Before leaving, Mira reached into her bag and carefully pulled out a page from her sketchbook. She'd worked on it all week, getting every detail just right. Her hands trembled slightly as she held it out to Rowan. The drawing showed the girl and Fox again, but this time they were curled up beside each other near a small campfire. The flames cast warm light across their faces, creating dancing shadows in the surrounding woods. Every line spoke of companionship, of shared silence, and understood pain. At the top of the page, in her careful artist's hand, she'd written the title, "The Girl and the Quiet Fox." Rowan accepted the drawing with gentle hands, studying it with the same careful attention he gave to everything. His eyes moved over each detail, taking in the story told in graphite and shadow. After a moment, he reached for his notepad again. His pen moved deliberately across the paper, and he turned it toward her. "She's not alone in the woods." Mira stared at him, holding his gaze longer than she ever had before. In that moment, something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words or even pictures. Then she nodded, gathering her things and turning toward the exit. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hospital parking lot as she walked away. Her steps were steady, more certain than they had been in weeks. The empty teacup was still warm in her hand, a reminder that sometimes healing came not in grand gestures or profound words, but in simple acts of quiet companionship. 2 days after her follow-up appointment, Mira found herself back at the hospital, clutching a folder containing a new drawing. This visit wasn't medical. Her heart fluttered with a different kind of nervousness as she made her way through the familiar corridors. The staff hallway was quiet during the afternoon lull. Mira hesitated at the corner, peeking around to see Rowan at his locker, organizing some papers. Her hand tightened on the folder as she gathered her courage. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into view and gave a small, shy wave. Rowan turned at the movement, surprise flickering across his face before settling into a warm smile. He hadn't expected to see her today. His expression said as much. He closed his locker quietly and turned to face her fully, his attention focused and patient as always. Mira stepped forward, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled out the folded paper from her folder. The drawing inside was different from her previous ones, more detailed, more personal. She held it out to him, watching as he accepted it with the same careful reverence he showed all her artwork. Over the next few weeks, their paths crossed more frequently. Sometimes it was during her scheduled checkups, where he'd appear with a new variety of tea before she could even mention being thirsty. Other times they'd spot each other in the hospital cafe, where Mira would be sketching between appointments or Rowan would be taking his lunch break. Their routine developed naturally, like water finding its path downstream. Mira began bringing illustrated thank you cards, each one decorated with whimsical doodles. Tiny foxes playing hide-and-seek between the letters, or little teacups with steam swirling into heart shapes. She'd leave them where she knew he'd find them, on his locker, at the nurse's station, or sometimes with the cafe staff who had come to know them both. Rowan's responses came in the form of his characteristic one-sentence notes, but each one held a weight that made Mira's heart skip. "Your art makes the hospital walls brighter," one would say. Another time, "The foxes in your drawings look less lonely now." And once, memorably, "You make silence feel like music." He began bringing her different teas, introducing her to new flavors she'd never tried before. One day it would be jasmine, its delicate floral scent filling the space between them as they sat in comfortable silence. Another day, he'd appear with hibiscus, the deep red liquid matching the blush in her cheeks when their fingers brushed during the handoff. The mint tea became her favorite for afternoon visits, its refreshing clarity matching the way she felt in his presence. Their silent conversations grew deeper, more meaningful. Mira found herself looking forward to each interaction, no matter how brief. She started carrying her sketchbook everywhere, capturing quick impressions of moments they shared. A steaming cup on a windowsill, the way sunlight filtered through the cafe blinds, the shadow of his hand as he wrote his notes. One late evening, After spending hours working on a new children's book illustration at home, Mira made an impulsive decision. She drove to the hospital, her heart pounding with equal parts nervousness and excitement. The night shift security guard recognized her now and gave her a friendly nod as she made her way through the quiet corridors. The door to the roof access was at the end of a seldom-used hallway. Mira pulled out a small sketch from her bag. She'd worked on it all afternoon. Two foxes sat side by side on what could be a rooftop, their tails just barely touching as they gazed out over a sea of twinkling city lights. She'd captured the peaceful solitude of the moment, the comfortable companionship of shared silence. With slightly trembling hands, she taped the sketch to the door. The hospital was quiet at this hour, and she felt like she was sharing a secret with the night itself. Taking one last look at the drawing, she hurried away, her footsteps echoing softly in the empty corridor. The next morning, Mira returned early, her stomach doing nervous flips as she approached the roof access door. There, next to her sketch, was a familiar piece of notepad paper, carefully taped. Her heart seemed to pause as she read the words written in Rowan's neat handwriting. "Next time you draw them, make them closer." A smile spread across her face, warm and genuine. She touched the note gently, tracing the words with her fingertip. There was something happening here, something that made her heart feel lighter than it had in months. It was beginning to feel real, this quiet dance they were doing, this gentle understanding that had grown between them. The following week brought an unexpected piece of mail to Mira's apartment. She sat at her kitchen table, turning the cream-colored envelope over in her hands several times before finally opening it. Inside was an invitation from the Riverside Art Gallery. They were hosting an open submission night for independent illustrators in the community. Mira's heart did a little flip as she read the details. The gallery was well known in local art circles, and having work displayed there could mean real exposure. But the thought of sharing her art, especially her recent pieces that felt so personal, made her stomach twist with anxiety. She spent the afternoon pacing her small living room, which had become a creative nest of sorts. Scattered sketches covered every surface, some pinned to walls, others stacked in precarious piles on the coffee table. Empty teacups formed a small army on various surfaces, each ring-stained saucer marking a different moment of contemplation. Her latest sketchbook lay open on the windowsill, showing various studies of foxes and quiet moments. Picking up her phone, Mira composed a careful text to her therapist, Dr. Chen. "Got invited to show at Riverside. Can't tell if I'm ready or just scared. How do you know when it's the right time to share?" She stared at the message for a long moment before hitting send, then picked up her sketchbook and began drawing absently. The lines flowed without conscious thought, a fox emerging from shadows, stars scattered across the page like dropped diamonds. She'd been drawing more lately, finding comfort in the familiar scratch of pencil on paper, but sharing these pieces. They felt like pages torn from a diary, too raw and honest for public viewing. Her phone buzzed with Dr. Chen's response. "Sometimes ready and scared happen at the same time. What would make this feel safer for you?" Mira looked at the fox on her page, its eyes somehow holding a familiar gentleness. She knew immediately what, or who, would make it feel safer. During her next hospital visit, Mira's hands were steady, but her heart raced as she approached the nurse's station where Rowan was reviewing charts. She had carefully folded the gallery flyer into a neat square, and now, trying to appear casual, she slipped it under his clipboard while he was writing. Rowan paused, noticing the paper. He picked it up with careful fingers, unfolding it with the same deliberate attention he gave to everything. His eyes moved across the page, taking in the details of the event. When he looked up, Mira was watching him with a playful, raised eyebrow, though her attempt at appearing nonchalant was betrayed by the slight flush in her cheeks. He reached for his notepad, the same one he'd been using since their first interaction. His pen moved quickly across the paper. "Are you asking me to come?" Mira tried to keep her voice light as she shrugged. though her heart was doing somersaults. "Only if you want to," she said, aiming for casual, but hearing the hope leak into her words. The week leading up to the gallery event passed in a blur of preparation. Mira selected her pieces carefully, each one feeling like she was sharing a piece of her soul. The centerpiece would be The Girl and the Quiet Fox, the image that had started it all, now refined and expanded into a proper illustration. She'd added details she hadn't noticed were missing before: stars that seemed to dance, shadows that held warmth instead of darkness, and a sense of peace that radiated from the canvas. On the night of the event, Mira arrived early to help set up her display. She wore a simple blue dress that made her feel both comfortable and presentable, though her hands wouldn't stop fidgeting with the hem. As other artists and guests began to arrive, she retreated to a corner, watching the room fill with strangers who moved between the displays with wine glasses and contemplative expressions. The gallery lights were warm and soft, creating intimate spaces around each piece of artwork. Mira's section was near a window, where the last rays of sunset added their own gentle illumination. She stood there, trying to make herself smaller, watching as people paused to look at her illustrations. Their expressions were appreciative, but she still felt exposed, vulnerable. Then she saw him. Rowan stood in the gallery entrance, looking somehow both familiar and new in a crisp button-down shirt, his dark hair neatly combed. He carried something in his hand, a single wildflower, its petals a soft purple that caught the gallery lights. In his other hand was one of his signature folded notes. Their eyes met across the room, and Mira felt the crowd of strangers fade away. Rowan made his way toward her, his movements careful and deliberate as always. When he reached her, he held out both the flower and the note, letting her choose which to take first. Mira accepted the note with trembling fingers, unfolding it carefully. His handwriting was as neat as ever, the words making her heart skip. "You made the world quiet enough to see the stars." She looked up at him, then at her artwork hanging behind them. The Girl and the Quiet Fox was bathed in the soft gallery lighting, the colors seeming to glow from within. The piece captured everything she'd been trying to say for months, about silence, about companionship, about finding peace in the quiet moments, about how sometimes the most profound connections don't need words at all. The morning sunlight streamed through Mira's bedroom window, casting a warm glow across her rumpled sheets. Her eyes fluttered open, and the first thing she saw was the wildflower from the gallery, standing tall in a small glass of water on her nightstand. The purple petals seemed to catch the light, creating tiny shadows that danced on her wall. Mira sat up slowly, running her fingers through her tangled hair as she remembered the previous evening. The gallery, the artwork, and most importantly, Rowan. Everything felt different now, as if the world had shifted ever so slightly on its axis. She reached for her sketchbook, which lay beside the flower, and opened it to a fresh page. Her pencil moved with purpose across the paper, capturing the scene from last night. She sketched the gallery space first, the warm lights, the high ceilings, the way the shadows pooled in corners and stretched across the wooden floors. Then she added two figures, standing close together but not quite touching. One held a wildflower, the other a small piece of paper. Around them, she drew halos of light and careful shadows, making the rest of the world fade into soft darkness. The sketch felt different from her previous ones. There was still quietness in it, but also something else, a kind of warmth that seemed to radiate from the page. She found herself adding little details, the way Rowan's shirt had been slightly wrinkled at the collar, how the gallery lights had caught in his dark hair, the gentle curve of his smile when he'd handed her the note. At the hospital later that day, Mira found herself walking through the familiar corridors with a new awareness. The usual antiseptic smell and fluorescent lighting felt less harsh somehow. She carried her sketchbook under one arm and a thermos of jasmine tea, the kind Rowan had introduced her to, in her other hand. She found him in the staff lounge, writing in a patient chart. He looked up as she entered, and his face softened into a smile. Without speaking, he reached for his notepad and wrote, "I liked your foxes last night." Mira settled into the chair across from him, pulling out her own pen and paper. She'd started carrying them specifically for these conversations. "Thank you for coming," she wrote back, "and for the flower." Their notes began flowing more freely then, passing back and forth across the table like a quiet dance. Each message revealed something new, something personal. Mira found herself asking questions she'd been curious about for weeks. "What made you become a doctor?" she wrote, her handwriting slightly messier than usual with nervousness. Rowan took his time with this response, his pen hovering over the paper for a moment before he began writing. When he passed the note back, Mira read, "Because no one spoke to me for months when I lost my voice. I didn't want anyone to feel that alone." The words made her chest tighten. She looked up at him, seeing him in a new light. He met her gaze steadily, his eyes holding a depth of understanding that suddenly made perfect sense. Her next question came without hesitation. "Is it ever lonely?" His response was quick this time. "Not lately." 2 simple words, but they made Mira's heart skip. She ducked her head to hide her smile, busying herself with taking a sip of tea. When she looked up again, Rowan was watching her with a gentle expression that made her feel both seen and safe. They continued exchanging notes throughout his break. He asked about her art, about when she started drawing foxes. She told him about her childhood sketchbooks filled with animal drawings, about how foxes always seemed to appear when she needed comfort the most. He shared stories about his medical school days, writing about long nights studying, and the first patient who made him realize why he'd chosen this path. Each note felt like unwrapping a small gift, revealing pieces of themselves they hadn't shared before. The silence between them was comfortable, punctuated only by the scratch of pens on paper and the occasional sip of tea. As Rowan's break drew to a close, he wrote one final note. "Thank you for making the silence feel like home." Mira held on to those words as she gathered her things to leave. She hadn't noticed Rowan slipping away briefly while she was packing up her sketchbook, too lost in her own thoughts about their conversation. It wasn't until she was halfway to the hospital exit that she felt something unfamiliar in her bag. Stopping in the quiet corridor, she reached inside and pulled out a package wrapped in brown paper. Her heart quickened. She knew she hadn't put it there herself. With careful fingers, she unwrapped the package. Inside was a book, hand-bound in soft leather, its pages thick and cream-colored. When she opened it, she found they were all blank except for the first page, which bore a simple title in Rowan's neat handwriting, "For More Quiet Stories." Mira's breath caught in her throat. She ran her fingers over the pages, feeling their texture, imagining all the possibilities they held. Without thinking, she turned and rushed back toward the staff area, her footsteps echoing in the corridor. But when she reached the lounge, it was empty. A nurse passing by saw her questioning look and said, "Dr. Vale? He just left for the day. Had a meeting across town." Mira stood there for a moment, holding the book close to her chest. Then she smiled, understanding that this was exactly right. This gift, like their relationship, didn't need immediate words or acknowledgement. It was perfect in its quietness. The hospital cafe buzzed with its usual morning activity as Mira stirred her coffee, watching the cream create swirling patterns in the dark liquid. She'd arrived early for her meeting with Rowan, their now regular Wednesday morning ritual. The familiar sounds of cups clinking and quiet conversations filled the air, but something felt different today. 2 doctors sat in the booth behind her, their voices low but clear enough to catch fragments of their conversation. Mira didn't mean to eavesdrop, but when she heard Rowan's name, her attention sharpened involuntarily. "Vale's considering it seriously," one doctor murmured. "The Swiss team has an impressive success rate." "Vocal reconstruction's come a long way," the other replied. "If anyone deserves a shot at speaking again, it's him. The clinical trials look promising." Mira's hand froze mid-stir, her spoon suspended above the coffee. Switzerland. Clinical trials. The words echoed in her mind, each repetition making her stomach twist tighter. She set the spoon down with trembling fingers, careful not to let it clink against the ceramic. 6 months minimum, though, the first doctor continued. That's a long time to be away. 6 months. The words hit Mira like a physical blow. She stared at her coffee, no longer seeing the swirls, just a dark void that seemed to mirror the one opening up inside her chest. The conversations around her faded into a distant hum as her mind raced through implications she wasn't ready to face. When Rowan arrived 30 minutes later, he looked the same as always, calm, collected, his presence immediately soothing. He carried 2 paper cups, having stopped at the tea cart outside as usual. But now Mira noticed things she hadn't before. The way his movements seemed more measured, how his eyes lingered a fraction longer on everything, as if memorizing details. They sat at their usual table by the window. Sunlight streamed in, casting long shadows across the surface. Rowan pulled out his notepad, but his writing was different today. Slower, more deliberate, as if each word carried extra weight. He wrote about a patient who'd made progress, about the morning traffic, about the new tea blend he'd brought her to try. Mira nodded and responded appropriately, but her mind kept returning to the conversation she'd overheard. Every pause felt loaded now, every silence heavy with unspoken words. She watched him write, noting how carefully he formed each letter and wondered how many more notes they had left. Finally, the weight of knowing became too much. During a lull in their exchange, Mira took a deep breath and wrote on her own notepad, "Are you leaving?" Rowan's face changed almost imperceptibly, a slight widening of the eyes, a barely noticeable tension in his jaw. He stared at her question for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then slowly, he began to write. His response, when it came, was characteristically honest. "It's a chance to speak again, but I'm still thinking." Mira felt something crack inside her chest. She looked down at her hands, noticing how tightly she was gripping her pen. When she looked up again, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You didn't think I deserved to know?" The hurt in her question was plain, hanging in the air between them like a physical presence. Rowan's expression softened with what looked like pain. He wrote quickly this time, then pushed the notepad toward her. "I didn't know if I deserved to ask you to care." The words blurred before Mira's eyes. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her vision. All their shared moments, the tea, the notes, the quiet understanding, suddenly felt fragile, like a soap bubble about to burst. The possibility of his leaving hadn't just opened up a future void. It had reached backward, tinting all their precious memories with the color of temporary. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Several heads turned at the noise, but she barely noticed. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Without looking at Rowan, she grabbed her bag and walked out, her steps quick and unsteady. The hospital corridors passed in a blur. She couldn't tell if she was angry or scared or just sad. Probably all three, tangled up together in a knot she couldn't begin to unravel. This feeling was familiar, though the cause was different. It was grief again, but this time for something that had barely begun, for possibilities that might never unfold, for words that might never be spoken. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Mira went through the motions of her routine, answering emails, sketching rough drafts for a new children's book, heating up leftover soup for dinner. But everything felt mechanical, distant, as if she were watching herself perform these actions from far away. As evening settled over the city, she finally headed home. The walk up to her apartment felt longer than usual, each step heavy with the weight of the day's revelations. But when she reached her door, something made her pause. There, taped at eye level, was a folded piece of paper. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for it, recognizing Rowan's neat handwriting even before she opened it. The message inside was simple, but devastating in its implications. If I had a voice, I'd only ever use it to tell you one thing, every day. Mira stood in the hallway, staring at the unsigned note until the words began to swim on the page. The ache in her chest intensified as she realized she didn't know, couldn't know, what that one thing would be. And somehow, that uncertainty hurt more than anything else. She went inside her apartment, closing the door softly behind her. The note felt impossibly heavy in her hand, weighted with all the words Rowan couldn't or wouldn't say. In the quiet of her home, surrounded by her drawings and half-empty teacups, Mira let herself feel the full force of what she might lose before she'd ever really had it. The month after Rowan's note crawled by in a blur of deadlines and late nights, Mira threw herself into her work, channeling all her unspoken feelings into the final illustrations of The Girl and the Quiet Fox. Her small apartment became a fortress of creativity, sketches pinned to walls, colored pencils scattered across every surface, and endless cups of different teas growing cold on her desk. The story had evolved from its initial concept. What started as simple drawings shared between two quiet souls had transformed into something deeper. Each page carried whispers of their connection, the fox's patient presence, the girl's gradual opening to trust, the way silence became its own language between them. On the last night of illustrations, Mira sat cross-legged on her living room floor, surrounded by the finished artwork. The final piece showed the girl and the fox sitting together under a vast night sky, their shadows merging into one. She traced her finger over the lines, remembering how it all began in a sterile hospital room with a simple offer of tea. The next morning, she carefully packaged the manuscript and artwork, addressing it to Starlight Press, a small independent publisher who'd shown interest after seeing her work at the gallery. Her hands shook slightly as she sealed the envelope, but her resolve was steady. This story deserved to be told, even if its real-life inspiration had taken an unexpected turn. Weeks passed. Mira kept busy with freelance work, trying not to check her email every few minutes. She avoided the hospital cafe, taking different routes when she needed to visit her doctor. Each time she saw someone in scrubs, her heart would skip, but it was never him. The acceptance email arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. Mira had to read it 3 times before the words sank in. Starlight Press loved the book. They wanted to publish it. They even suggested a launch event at the Cozy Corner, a charming bookstore just 2 blocks from the hospital. Mira sat at her kitchen table staring at her laptop screen. The location couldn't be coincidental. The universe seemed to have a sense of humor. Or perhaps it was just another test of her resilience. Either way, she replied with a simple, "Yes, thank you," and then spent the next hour alternating between excited pacing and nervous sketching. The weeks leading up to the launch were a whirlwind of preparations. Proof copies arrived, each one perfect bound and smelling of fresh ink. The cover art, the girl and fox silhouetted against a star-filled sky, seemed to glow in the light. Mira ran her fingers over the embossed title, hardly believing it was real. The morning of the launch dawned clear and cool. Mira stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the collar of her simple blue dress. She'd pinned a small silver fox brooch to her lapel, a gift from her therapist to celebrate the book. Her hands trembled as she applied minimal makeup, and she had to redo her eyeliner twice before getting it right. The Cozy Corner was everything its name promised. Wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with carefully curated books. Plants hung in macrame holders near the windows, and comfortable armchairs were scattered throughout. The owner had set up a small signing table near the front, with Mira's books arranged in an artful display. People began arriving shortly after the doors opened. Local art enthusiasts who remembered her from the gallery show, fellow illustrators from the children's book community, even a few nurses from the hospital who'd seen her drawings during her recovery. Each interaction warmed her heart, but she couldn't help scanning the door every time it opened. The afternoon progressed pleasantly. Mira signed books, chatted with readers, and explained the inspiration behind her illustrations. She carefully avoided mentioning specific details about the story's origins, though several people commented on the emotional depth of the Silent Fox character. As the event began winding down, the crowd thinned to just a few browsers examining books on distant shelves. Mira was organizing her signing pens when she heard the shop door open one more time. She didn't look up immediately, had trained herself not to over the past month, but something in the quality of the silence made her pause. When she finally raised her eyes, her heart stuttered. There, standing at the back of the store, was a man in a simple brown coat. Even from this distance, she could see the familiar scar on his throat. Rowan. He looked exactly the same, yet somehow different. More present, more certain. The few remaining customers continued their quiet browsing, unaware of the weight of this moment. Mira sat very still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She watched as Rowan slowly made his way forward, his movements deliberate and unhurried, just as she remembered. When he reached her table, he pulled out his notepad, the same one he'd always used. The sound of his pen moving across paper was achingly familiar. He held the note out to her with steady hands. "I didn't go. I already have everything I'd want to say, and you understand all of it." Mira stared at the words, feeling tears well up in her eyes. Everything she'd been holding back for the past month, the fear, the hope, the unspoken possibilities, seemed to release at once. Her whisper was barely audible, meant more for her own heart than for anyone else. "You came back." The last customer waved goodbye, leaving Mira alone in the warmth of the cozy corner. Through the front windows, street lamps cast long golden rectangles across the wooden floor, making the dust motes dance in their light. Her hands moved mechanically, gathering unsigned books and stacking them in neat piles, but her mind was elsewhere, fixed on the quiet presence still lingering by the entrance. Rowan stood near the door, one shoulder resting against the frame, giving her the space she needed to process everything. He didn't fidget or check his phone like most people would. Instead, he maintained that familiar, peaceful stillness that had first drawn her to him in the hospital. His brown coat was slightly rumpled, as if he'd been wearing it all day, perhaps debating whether to come. The bookstore owner, a kind elderly woman named Martha, dimmed the overhead lights, creating a cocoon of soft shadows and warm lamplight. "Take your time, dear," she called from behind the counter. "I'll be in the back doing inventory." Her footsteps retreated, leaving Mira and Rowan in comfortable silence. Mira's fingers traced the embossed cover of her book. The fox and the girl, their story now bound in permanent ink. How many times had she imagined this moment differently? In her darker hours, she'd pictured him gone to Switzerland, voice restored, living a completely different life. Yet here he was, choosing to remain in their shared silence. She slipped her remaining supplies into her messenger bag, colored pens, thank you cards, and her ever-present sketchbook. Her movements were deliberate, almost meditative, as if she were gathering not just her belongings, but also her courage. The silver fox brooch on her lapel caught the light as she finally stood up, reaching for her coat. Rowan straightened from his position by the door, his eyes meeting hers with the same gentle intensity she remembered. There was something different in his gaze now, a certainty that hadn't been there before. He didn't move toward her, letting her choose the next step. Mira walked over, her coat clutched close to her chest like a shield. The distance between them felt both vast and microscopic. Neither spoke, him by necessity, her by choice. The city sounds filtered in through the glass door, distant traffic, the occasional footsteps of passers-by, the soft whoosh of wind through trees. His hands moved with practiced grace as he pulled out his notepad. The pen scratched quietly against paper, and Mira found herself missing that sound, realizing how it had become a sort of music to her. He held out the note. "I didn't think I had the right to interrupt your healing. Something shifted in Mira's chest, a knot loosening, a wall crumbling. She reached for her own pen, borrowing the corner of his notepad. Her response was quick but certain. You weren't interrupting. You were part of it. They shared a look that contained months of unspoken conversations. Then, by mutual understanding, they moved toward the door. Martha appeared briefly to lock up behind them, giving them a knowing smile as they stepped out into the evening air. A wooden bench sat just outside the bookstore, bathed in the warm glow of the storefront. They settled there together, close but not touching, as the city hummed its gentle lullaby around them. A bus rumbled past. Someone laughed in a nearby cafe. A wind chime tinkled from a neighboring shop's awning. Rowan pulled out a fresh notebook, not his usual medical notepad, but a proper journal with clean pages. He wrote carefully, then turned it so Mira could read. I was 16 when I lost my voice. Before that, I used to sing in the school choir. Funny how you don't appreciate something until it's gone. Mira's heart tightened. She took the pen, her artist's hand steady despite her emotions. After my first miscarriage, I couldn't draw for 6 months. Every time I tried, my hands would shake. It felt like losing my voice too. Back and forth they went, the notebook becoming a bridge between their worlds. Rowan wrote about the months of silence after his surgery, when even his family struggled to communicate with him. How he'd learned to read people's eyes, their gestures, the things they said without speaking. Mira shared about her second loss, how she'd stopped going to baby showers, how she'd buried herself in children's book illustrations because they let her create the magic she couldn't find in real life. She wrote about how drawing foxes became her therapy, their solitary nature, their quiet strength. The street grew quieter as evening deepened. A cool breeze carried the scent of approaching autumn, rustling through nearby trees. Their confessions continued, each one careful and honest. Sometimes I still dream in my old voice, he wrote. Sometimes I still name the children I lost, she replied. The hardest part wasn't losing speech. It was watching people give up trying to listen, his pen traced across the page. I understand, she wrote back. Silence is easier when someone shares it with you. Their hands occasionally brushed as they passed the notebook back and forth. Each touch felt significant, like punctuation marks in their written conversation. The notebook filled with their shared truth, about loneliness, about healing, about finding understanding in unexpected places. As the evening grew later, they could see their breath in the cooling air. A nearby church bell chimed 9 times. Rowan checked his watch reluctantly, then wrote one final note for the evening. I've never missed sound less than I do right now. Mira read the words, feeling their weight settle in her chest. Without hesitation, she reached over and touched his hand. No words were needed, written or otherwise. In the gentle glow of the bookstore lights, with their shared notebook between them, they had said everything that mattered. Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear as Mira stood in her bedroom, methodically folding clothes into an old duffel bag. Sunlight streamed through her window, catching dust motes in its beams and illuminating the organized chaos of her apartment. Stacks of art supplies, half-finished sketches, and empty teacups scattered about. Her hands paused as she reached into her bedside drawer, pulling out a weathered photograph. The edges were soft and worn, but the image remained clear. A rustic cabin nestled against a backdrop of pine trees, its wooden dock stretching out over mirror-still water. Her grandmother's retreat, now hers, though she hadn't visited since the funeral 3 years ago. Mira traced the outline of the cabin with her finger. The photo stirred something in her chest. Memories of quiet summer evenings, the smell of pine needles, and her grandmother's peaceful presence. The cabin had always been a sanctuary, a place where silence felt natural rather than heavy. She tucked the photo carefully into her sketchbook and continued packing. Warm sweaters, her favorite drawing supplies, tea bags, including the jasmine blend Rowan had introduced her to, and a few basic groceries. The familiar motions of preparing for the trip felt right, like her body had been waiting for her mind to catch up to this decision. In her tiny kitchen, Mira pulled out a sheet of her good drawing paper, the thick, cream-colored kind she usually saved for special projects. Her pen moved deliberately across the surface, forming words that felt both terrifying and absolutely necessary. "I'm going to the lake, for some real quiet. Come if you want." She added the cabin's address and basic directions, then folded the paper carefully, sliding it into an envelope. She wrote, "Dr. Rowan Vale," on the front in her best calligraphy, the letters flowing like they did in her illustrations. The hospital was quiet when she arrived, that peculiar Sunday morning hush that made even the fluorescent lights seem softer. The receptionist at the front desk, an older woman with kind eyes, accepted the envelope with a knowing smile. "I'll make sure he gets it," she promised, placing it carefully in the staff mail slot. Mira nodded her thanks and left quickly before she could change her mind. The drive to the lake took just over 2 hours, the city gradually giving way to rolling hills and eventually thick forest. The familiar dirt road appeared, winding through trees that seemed to lean in close, creating a tunnel of green and gold. The cabin looked smaller than she remembered, its dark wood weathered but solid. Wild grass had grown up around the edges, and the flower boxes her grandmother had lovingly maintained sat empty. But the key was still hidden under the loose board on the porch, just as it had always been. Inside, everything was exactly as she'd left it. Dust covers protected the furniture, and the air held that particular stillness of long, uninhabited spaces. But underneath was the cabin's essential character: the solid oak floors, the stone fireplace, the wall of windows facing the lake. Mira spent the next few hours bringing the cabin back to life. She opened windows to let in the fresh air, swept away cobwebs, and made up the bed with clean linen she'd brought from home. The kitchen needed little work. Her grandmother had always kept it meticulously organized. The old kettle still sat on the stove, ready for use. Outside, she found the woodpile well stocked and covered, the logs dry despite recent rain. She carried in enough for the evening and arranged them in the fireplace, though she didn't light it yet. The dock needed checking. A few boards creaked under her weight, but the structure remained sturdy, reaching out over water so clear she could see fish darting beneath the surface. As the day progressed, Mira settled into the cabin's rhythm. She unpacked her art supplies, setting up a small workspace near the windows. The light was perfect for drawing, just as she remembered. She worked on several sketches, quick studies of the trees, the way shadows played on the water, a family of ducks that paddled past in the late afternoon. But as dusk approached, she found herself glancing more frequently at the gravel driveway. The shadows lengthened, and the lake took on the purple hue of evening. She told herself it was okay if he didn't come. This trip wasn't about that. It was about reconnecting with this place, with herself. She built a fire as the temperature dropped, its warm light filling the cabin with dancing shadows. Her sketchbook lay open on her lap, but she wasn't really drawing anymore, just adding random lines, her mind elsewhere. Then, just as the last direct sunlight was fading from the lake, she heard it, the distinct crunch of tires on gravel, followed by the soft thud of a car door closing. Her heart jumped into her throat. Footsteps approached, unhurried but purposeful. Mira stood, moving to the window. Rowan was walking up the path, a small backpack slung over one shoulder. He wore casual clothes, jeans, and a soft flannel shirt, so different from his usual hospital attire. His notepad was in his hand, as always. He looked up and saw her in the window, offering a small wave. She met him at the door, suddenly shy despite everything they'd shared. He held up his notepad. "Hope I'm not too late." She shook her head, smiling, and stepped aside to let him in. He took in the cabin with appreciative eyes, nodding at the fire, the art supplies, the view of the darkening lake through the windows. They moved around each other easily as the night settled in, falling into their comfortable pattern of silent communication. Mira made tea, while Rowan added another log to the fire. She showed him around the cabin with simple gestures, and he responded with understanding nods. When the stars began appearing, they gathered blankets and moved out to the dock. The wood was still warm from the day's sun, and the lake had gone completely still, reflecting the sky like a perfect mirror. They sat side by side, wrapped in separate blankets, but close enough to share warmth. Mira opened her sketchbook, beginning to capture the way moonlight played on the water. Beside her, Rowan wrote in his notepad. Not messages to her, but observations, like a poet collecting images. Pine shadows on silver water. Fish jumping, concentric rings spreading. Loon call echoing. They stayed like that, content in their parallel activities. The silence between them as natural as breathing. The night deepened around them, stars multiplying overhead until the Milky Way was visible, a river of light across the dark sky. Neither felt the need to move inside. Eventually, their heads grew heavy with peace and fatigue. They leaned back on the dock, blankets cushioning the hard wood. Their heads tilted toward each other, not quite touching, but close enough to share the same view of the stars. The silence hummed between them like a living thing, a language they'd created together, more eloquent than words could ever be. The morning light filtered through the mist hanging over the lake, creating a dreamlike quality that made the cabin feel suspended in time. Inside, the soft sounds of cooking filled the small kitchen as Rowan moved with careful precision around the old stove. His hair was slightly disheveled from sleep. The sleeves of his flannel shirt rolled up to his elbows as he tended to the eggs sizzling in the cast iron pan. Mira sat at the small kitchen table, her sketchbook propped against her knees. Her pencil moved in quick, sure strokes, capturing the way Rowan's shoulders relaxed as he cooked, how his movements seemed more fluid here than in the sterile hospital corridors. She paid special attention to the morning light catching his profile, the slight curl at the nape of his neck, the careful way he handled her grandmother's old cooking implements. The coffee maker gurgled softly, filling the cabin with its rich aroma. Rowan had found 2 mugs in the cupboard, one decorated with faded wildflowers, the other a souvenir from some long-ago vacation spot. The mismatched pair somehow felt perfect for this quiet morning. At the bottom of her sketch, Mira wrote in her flowing script, "Where peace lives." The words felt right, capturing not just the image but the feeling of this moment, the safety of it, the gentle certainty. Days began to flow together like watercolors bleeding into one another. They fell into an easy rhythm, their silence taking on new dimensions. Words appeared in unexpected places, messages written in the condensation on windows, notes scribbled in the margins of the local newspaper they picked up from the small store down the road, thoughts jotted on paper napkins during meals. One afternoon, sitting on the porch watching birds at the feeder, Mira began teaching Rowan simple hand signs, not formal ASL, but their own private language. 3 quick taps on any surface came to mean stay. A circle drawn on the palm asked for elaboration. Tell me more. A finger pressed briefly to the heart said everything words couldn't. They developed dozens of these small signals, each one carrying meaning that went deeper than its simple gesture. It became a dance of sorts, their hands speaking in moments when even writing felt too formal. When Rowan wanted tea, he'd mime holding a cup and raise an eyebrow. When Mira needed quiet time to draw, she'd touch her temple twice. They learned to read each other's smallest movements, the tilt of a head, the quirk of lips, the way eyes softened or focused. A thunderstorm rolled in one afternoon, turning the lake into a canvas of ripples and sending them inside. They sat on the old couch, watching lightning illuminate the churning water. The rain drummed on the roof, creating a cocoon of sound around them. Rowan pulled out his notepad, his pen moving more slowly than usual, as if each word carried extra weight. If I had gone, I would have come back with a voice, but I would have lost this. Mira read the words several times, feeling their truth settle in her chest. She took the pen from his hand, their fingers brushing, and wrote beneath his message, "This is louder than anything you could have said." The thunder rolled outside, but neither of them heard it. Rowan's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch as gentle as his written words. When their lips met, it felt like the natural conclusion to a conversation they'd been having all along. The kiss was soft, unhurried, certain, like they had all the time in the world to learn this new language between them. Weeks passed like pages turning in a beloved book, each day adding to their shared story. But eventually, the real world began to call them back. The hospital needed Rowan, and Mira had illustration deadlines approaching. They packed slowly, reluctantly, each item a reminder of the sanctuary they'd built here. In the living room, Mira picked up the notebook they'd been sharing, filled now with their combined handwriting, sketches, and the occasional pressed leaf or flower. She wrote Volume 1 on the cover in her artistic script, the words both an ending and a beginning. Rowan watched her do this, then held out his hand for the pen. Inside the front cover, he added his own message, "For every story we never had to say out loud." They loaded their bags into their cars. They'd driven separately, but would leave together. As they pulled away from the cabin, their vehicles in convoy, their hands found each other across the center console. No music played on the radio. They didn't need it. The quiet wrapped around them like a familiar blanket, and the road ahead stretched out, waiting to show them where their story would lead next. The trees cast dappled shadows on the windshield as they drove, the morning sun breaking through in patterns that reminded Mira of her own illustrations. Rowan's thumb traced small circles on her hand, their signal for contentment. The gesture said everything about this moment, about them, about the understanding they'd built in the silence of the lake house. The familiar landscape rolled past their windows, the old general store where they'd bought groceries, the bend in the road where they'd often stopped to watch deer, the mailbox with the painted bluebirds that marked the turn onto the main highway. Each landmark was now part of their shared memory, added to the quiet collection of moments they'd gathered like precious stones. As they merged onto the highway that would take them back to the city, Mira glanced at their joined hands, then at Rowan's profile. He caught her looking and smiled, that same gentle expression she'd captured in countless sketches over the past weeks. She squeezed his hand 3 times. "Stay." His response was immediate, 3 squeezes back. A promise, silent but sure, carried forward with them into whatever came next. If you enjoyed the story of Mira and Rowan, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.